Part 2 is an overview of how the Old Testament is organized and the titles of the sections of the Old Testament. So, how do we present the Bible as an entire book? Put a marker in between the Old and New Testaments for this point, and then share something like this. The Bible is like a library. It has two large sections, the Old Testament at the beginning of the Bible and the New Testament, the last part of the Bible. The Old Testament is about twice as long as the New Testament. The word testament means promise or the true writings and the true testimonies. The Bible, therefore, is God's true promise to us. These sections are divided into smaller books. There are 66 smaller books in the entire Bible, 39 in the Old Testament, and 27 in the New Testament. The Old Testament was originally written in the Hebrew language, the language of God's people, the Israelites, who were often called Hebrews. All of the people in the Old Testament lived before Jesus was born, and all of the events happened before Jesus was born. Now, ask the people in your study to open their Bibles to the table of contents. Draw attention to the list of the Old Testament and the New Testament books, because you'll be referring to them throughout this part of the study. Some people may want to jot a few notes into the table of contents. Remind them that there are 39 smaller books in the Old Testament, and then show them the numbers 5, 12, 5, 5, 12. Sort of like a special code for deciphering the Old Testament. This is the pattern of how the Old Testament is divided into sections. Then briefly explain these sections using some type of visuals. The first 5 books of the Old Testament are called the books of the law, or the books of Moses, because they were written by Moses. They contain creation, they begin with creation, and include God's commandments and laws for His people and all the people of the world. Refer to those first 5 books in their table of contents. The next section in the Old Testament contains the 12 books of history, the history of God's people, the Israelites, and includes the stories of people like Joshua, Kings David and Solomon, several prophets such as Elijah and Elisha, and many other people. Point out these 12 books in the table of contents. You may even want to have someone read through those names. These first 17 books of the Old Testament are mostly in chronological order, or in the order of time. The next section of the Old Testament contains the 5 books of poetry. These include Job, the story of a man who had a lot of trouble in his life, Psalms, which are poems, thoughts, and worship songs, most of them written by King David, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon, or the Song of Songs, which were books of wisdom and proverbs written by King Solomon. Then comes the 5 major prophets. You see how that code 5, 12, 5, 5, 12 is working. The major prophets means that these are very important prophets in the history of Israel, and these books are long. They're longer than any of the other prophets. These prophets were men of God who told special messages from God. The books are named after these prophets who wrote them. And again, point out those 5 prophets. The last section of the Old Testament are those of the minor prophets. Minor means smaller, shorter, and in some cases not as well known as the major prophets. These books are also named after the prophets who wrote them, and point out again the names of these 12 minor prophets and possibly pronounce some of them. Ask if they have any questions about the Old Testament sections. Review the 5:12, 5:5, 12 sections: law, history, poetry, major prophets, and minor prophets. If this is too much information for at the beginning or the very end of your Bible study, you can divide it up more than what I've done.